She had endured endless scorn, every insult from the billionaire family searing her pride. But in one quiet, deliberate moment, she looked up and spoke just 5 words. And suddenly, the room went deathly silent. What could she have said? If this story resonated with you, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as beautiful as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The Montclair mansion stood like a monument to wealth and power, its marble pillars glinting under the early sunlight. Every hallway echoed with the soft shuffle of polished shoes and the faint hum of air conditioning, while chandeliers hung like frozen stars above rooms filled with rare art and priceless antiques. This was a world of perfection, of appearances meticulously maintained, where a single misstep could ripple into disaster. Through this world moved Amina, a young black maid, her uniform crisp but her hands calloused from long hours of labor. She carried herself with quiet grace, her spine straight, her steps measured, yet her eyes betrayed a mind that refused to be invisible. She knew every corner, every creaking floorboard, every habit of the family she served. Yet for all her knowledge, each day was a test of endurance, a test of her dignity against the cruelty of those who saw her as nothing more than a servant. In the study, Ethan Montclair, heir to a vast fortune, leaned back in his leather chair, flipping through financial reports with a sense of practiced superiority. He had inherited wealth, power, and entitlement in equal measure, believing that everyone and everything existed to serve his ambitions. To him, the staff were shadows in the background of his life, useful, invisible, dispensable. His mother, Vivian, moved through the house like a silent queen, her sharp eyes noting every detail. Her elegance was matched only by her coldness, her disdain a shield she wore to protect the family's image. Approval from her was rare, and mistakes were punished not just with correction, but with subtle humiliation. Even in a house full of riches, Amina found herself treading a fragile line. Her friend Lydia, another maid with years of experience, often warned her to stay invisible, to bend without breaking, to survive without confronting. Lydia's eyes, however, held traces of regret for her own compromises, and every small glance she cast toward Amina was a mix of caution and concern. Amina absorbed these lessons but could not allow them to fully shape her. Beneath her careful obedience simmered a quiet pride, a sense that she was more than the labels others placed upon her. The mansion itself seemed to respond to the tension. Silver clinked faintly in the dining room as other maids polished cutlery. Curtains swayed slightly as the morning breeze slipped through tall windows. Even the scent of fresh flowers, lilies and roses meticulously arranged, felt like a mask over the underlying harshness of power and class. Amina moved among these symbols of wealth with careful composure, her hands steady as she adjusted a vase or dusted a shelf. But her mind never stopped watching, remembering, analyzing. Ethan's impatience was a constant hum in the background. Even the smallest imperfection, a smudge on a plate, a slightly crooked napkin, drew his sharp eyes. Vivian's presence amplified the pressure, her silent judgment heavier than any spoken word. For Amina, every glance carried weight, every sigh, every smirk, every whispered comment from the wealthy family members was a reminder of her position in the world. And yet, in this contrast, Amina's quiet dignity against Ethan's arrogance, her resilience against Vivian's cold perfection, something unspoken lingered. Amina's mind was alive with thoughts of her family far away, of dreams she had been forced to put on hold, of a life she had once imagined for herself. These internal worlds of longing and pride gave her strength. Even as she moved through a space that sought to define and diminish her, there was a spark within, a resilience that no insult or glance could fully erase. The day seemed ordinary, but the tension was palpable. Every polished surface, every whisper of staff, every glance from the Montclair family carried the weight of expectation and judgment. And somewhere in this web of wealth and power, Amina's quiet strength waited, ready to meet the moment when a single act would ripple through the mansion, shaking its very foundations. The morning sun filtered through the grand windows of the Montclair mansion, casting long shadows over the polished floors. It was a day like any other, yet the air seemed heavier, as if something unseen was waiting to unfold. Amina moved through the halls, carrying a tray of delicate pastries for the Montclair family's brunch with visiting investors. Each step was precise, rehearsed, but her mind was alert to the subtle signals around her. The flicker of Vivian's eyes, Ethan's impatient tapping on the armrest, the faint whispers exchanged among the guests. Amina had learned to anticipate criticism, to mask her reactions, to carry the weight of the family's disdain as quietly as possible. But as she approached the dining room, a misstep, slightly misjudging the threshold, sent a delicate pastry teetering on the edge of the tray. Time seemed to slow. The pastry wobbled, tipped, and fell to the floor with a soft, fatal thud. A hush swept over the room. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he barked. "Amina, really? Is that the best you can do?" His voice cut like glass, sharp and unyielding. The investors glanced uneasily, sensing the tension. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes a mix of cold amusement and reproach. She gestured dismissively with a gloved hand, silently signaling that Amina should handle the embarrassment herself. Amina's hands trembled only slightly as she bent to retrieve the fallen pastry, murmuring an apology that barely rose above a whisper. Her cheeks burned, not just from the accident, but from the weight of eyes upon her, eyes that measured her worth, judged her place, and sought to remind her of her correct role in their world. Lydia, who had been standing discreetly nearby, cast a worried glance, silently pleading for Amina to remain calm, to survive without resistance. But something inside Amina shifted. Each laugh, each snicker, each sharp word from the Montclairs had been absorbed, counted, and stored, not with bitterness, but with a quiet determination. She straightened, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. In that moment, the audience senses the electricity in the room. Amina's pride and dignity, usually veiled in obedience, had ignited. The incident that seemed small, a pastry on the floor, was no longer just an accident. It had become a spark, a trigger, a subtle rebellion that only needed words to fully ignite. The investors shifted in their seats, exchanging glances as they sensed the tension but could not yet understand it. Ethan's face flushed with irritation, his mouth slightly open as if to unleash another insult. Yet he hesitated. There was a pause, pregnant with anticipation, that stretched long enough to make every heartbeat audible. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, the polished floors reflecting not just sunlight but the simmering storm about to break. Amina's eyes met Ethan's for the first time with a steady, unflinching gaze. The fire in them was quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. This was not the trembling, subservient girl who had walked these halls before. This was someone who had endured enough, whose patience had a limit, whose dignity demanded recognition. The room, filled with wealth, power, and arrogance, had yet to see the force about to emerge from the servant they had long underestimated. And then, in a voice calm yet commanding, she prepared to speak the words that would freeze the room, that would make the Montclairs realize the boundaries they had overstepped. Every movement, every glance, every sound, the clinking silver, the shifting chairs, the hushed murmurs, served to amplify the moment. The story had reached its ignition point. Humiliation had met resolve, and the spark was ready to ignite a fire no one in the mansion would forget. The room remained silent for a heartbeat after Amina spoke the 5 words that cut through the air. Then the world seemed to tilt. Ethan's jaw tightened, his face draining of color as if he had been slapped. Vivian's eyes widened, her usual composure faltering for the first time in years. The investors, previously uncertain, now leaned forward, curiosity and disbelief mirrored on their faces. Every glance, every movement carried weight, as though the mansion itself had shifted under the force of Amina's words. Amina stood perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her breathing steady. She did not raise her voice, did not plead or explain. She allowed the impact of her statement to settle, letting the silence amplify its power. Lydia's eyes shone with awe and relief. She knew Amina had finally taken a stand, and the reverberations of this act were only beginning. Ethan struggled to regain control, clearing his throat and forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "Well, that's unexpected," he muttered, though every word lacked conviction. Vivian's lips pressed into a firm line, the corners twitching with irritation and disbelief. For once, her dominance was challenged, and she felt the unfamiliar sting of being unsettled. The investors whispered among themselves, some exchanging incredulous glances, others pretending to take notes, unsure how to react. Amina's words had shifted the power dynamic in the room, exposing the arrogance and cruelty of the Montclairs in a subtle but undeniable way. Every insult they had delivered, every belittling glance, suddenly felt inadequate against the quiet force of her dignity. Tension rippled outward, touching every corner of the mansion. The staff exchanged furtive looks. The younger maids, who had long accepted their invisibility, saw in Amina a model of strength and courage. Even the seasoned but cautious Lydia felt a flicker of hope. If Amina could challenge the family in this way, perhaps change was possible. Ethan's mind raced, a mixture of humiliation and anger boiling beneath his calm facade. He had never expected defiance from someone in Amina's position. Vivian, too, found herself unsteady, a rare moment of vulnerability exposing the cracks in her perfect exterior. The mansion, usually a place of rigid control and predictable routines, now buzzed with tension, the echoes of Amina's statement lingering like a storm cloud. Amina's silent defiance had transformed a simple morning mishap into a seismic event. The Montclairs could no longer view her merely as a servant. She had become a force they could neither ignore nor suppress. And as she retreated gracefully to continue her duties, the room remained unsettled, everyone aware that the balance of power had shifted, perhaps irreversibly. The first ripple had hit, but it was only the beginning. The humiliation, the defiance, and the shockwaves were now set in motion, promising consequences that would touch every member of the mansion in ways they could not yet imagine. The morning's stillness had shattered, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that vibrated through every room of the Montclair mansion. Ethan retreated to his study, slamming the door behind him, his mind a storm of anger and disbelief. How could a maid, someone he considered beneath notice, or speak back with such calm authority? His pride, carefully cultivated through wealth and power, refused to accept it. Every word Amina had spoken replayed in his mind, each echo fueling irritation and the gnawing sting of humiliation. Vivian, too, refused to show weakness, but behind her icy gaze, anxiety stirred. She prowled the halls like a predator sensing a disruption in the order she had long maintained. Every servant who crossed her path received a subtle reprimand, a glance that reminded them of their place. The household operated with precision, but now friction threaded through every corner. Whispered side glances, awkward pauses, and the faint tremor of unease. Meanwhile, Amina returned to her duties, moving as if nothing had happened, yet internally, she carried a quiet satisfaction. She understood the gravity of what she had done. She had challenged centuries of entitlement in just 5 words, but she also knew that resistance would come. The Montclairs would not accept being confronted without attempting to restore control, and their efforts would test her patience, composure, and resolve. Even the other staff sensed the shift. Lydia whispered reassurances, though her voice carried tension. "They won't let it go easily," she murmured, eyes flicking toward the Montclairs. "Just stay careful, Amina." But Amina only smiled faintly, a spark of defiance in her eyes. She had endured humiliation before. This time, she would not allow it to define her. In the drawing room, Ethan forced a calm voice in front of the investors, attempting to reclaim authority. "It's all under control," he said, though the words sounded hollow. Vivian interjected with her signature elegance, offering compliments that barely masked her agitation, attempting to weave control back into the fractured atmosphere. But the subtle tremor in her voice betrayed her unease. The family's carefully maintained superiority was beginning to show cracks, and the staff and visitors could sense it. The mansion, once a stage for dominance and obedience, had become a battlefield of invisible power. The Montclairs resisted openly through words and gestures, and secretly through calculation and subtle manipulation. Every movement of Amina, every glance exchanged with Lydia, became a challenge to the hierarchy they had long controlled. Tension thickened in the halls and rooms, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the next confrontation. The spark event had ignited a fire, and the Montclair's resistance only fanned its flames. Both arrogance and fear were now coiled tightly in their hearts, while Amina's quiet strength promised that she would not back down. The following afternoon, the mansion buzzed with a new kind of tension. A gala was scheduled in the Montclair's Grand Hall, an event meant to impress investors and socialites alike. Amina, tasked with serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres, found herself navigating the same rooms that had recently borne witness to her quiet defiance. The air was heavy with expectation, scrutiny, and unspoken threats. Ethan moved through the hall with calculated ease, attempting to reclaim his authority in front of the guests. Yet, every time he glanced toward Amina, his irritation flared anew. She moved among the elegantly dressed attendees with composure, her presence graceful and unassuming, but impossible to ignore. Each time she offered a tray of drinks or a polite smile, it was a reminder that she had already shifted the balance of power. Vivian, too, remained vigilant, her eyes constantly on Amina, yet she could not afford to publicly confront her. The gala demanded appearances, and any overt reprimand would embarrass the family further in front of influential guests. Still, she found subtle ways to assert control, tiny gestures, forced glances, pointed instructions to the staff that were meant to remind everyone, especially Amina, of her place. Even Lydia moved beside Amina with quiet caution, warning her of subtle traps and observing the Montclair's every move. Yet the proximity forced Amina to engage, to maneuver skillfully through a world that had tried to humiliate her, using grace and intelligence as her shield. Every interaction with the Montclairs was a test. A tray passed too slowly could provoke Ethan's scorn. A misplaced comment could spark Vivian's icy fury. The gala became a stage for tension. Every step Amina took was observed. Every word she whispered to a guest noted, and every smile she offered tested. The Montclair's attempts at resistance collided with Amina's quiet confidence, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere. The physical closeness of their worlds, staff and master, defiance and arrogance, made confrontation inevitable, yet also revealed cracks in the family's control. As the evening progressed, Amina's poise remained unshaken. She moved not with fear, but with precision, aware that the Montclair's scrutiny was as much a weapon against themselves as it was against her. Each forced interaction, each accidental brush of hands, each shared glance, became charged with unspoken meaning. For the first time, the family could not dismiss her as invisible. Proximity made her presence undeniable. The mansion, elegant and imposing, no longer felt like a place of absolute dominance. Instead, it became a stage where hidden tensions, suppressed resentment, and quiet courage collided. The spark event had set the fire, resistance had fanned it, and now forced proximity ensured that neither side could ignore the shifting power dynamic. Days after the gala, the Montclair mansion hummed with an uneasy energy. Every corner seemed charged with anticipation, each glance and gesture layered with suspicion. Ethan's irritation had not faded. Instead, it simmered beneath the surface, coloring every interaction with Amina. He found himself watching her movements obsessively, searching for any excuse to reassert dominance, yet each attempt felt increasingly hollow. Vivian, ever the strategist, tightened her grip on the household, issuing precise instructions to staff with a razor-sharp edge. No one dared question her, but her constant surveillance created tension that seeped into every room. Even the quiet servants, long accustomed to obedience, now exchanged nervous glances, sensing that the balance of power was shifting in ways they had never witnessed. Amina, meanwhile, continued her duties with measured grace, her calm demeanor only intensifying the frustration of the Montclairs. A misplaced tray or an accidental stumble that might have once resulted in humiliation now carried a new weight. The family's anger met with her quiet defiance, creating friction at every turn. Her poise was a silent challenge, a reminder that her dignity could not be easily broken. Small incidents became catalysts for conflict. Ethan snapped at a maid over a trivial error, only to realize Amina had anticipated his irritation and corrected it before he could act. Vivian's sharp rebukes sometimes faltered in mid-sentence, caught off guard by Amina's calm composure or subtle, pointed observations. Each failed attempt to regain control left them increasingly unsettled. The tension extended beyond the family. Guests at the mansion, whether investors, friends, or acquaintances, began to notice the subtle discord. Whispers of curiosity and speculation floated through conversations as the Montclair's flawless image cracked, revealing the struggle beneath. The staff, too, felt the strain, caught between loyalty, fear, and the rising admiration they held for Amina's courage. Even Lydia found herself on edge. She understood Amina's strength, but worried about the consequences of openly defying the Montclairs. Every day was a test of endurance and wit, requiring careful navigation to avoid overt conflict while still asserting a quiet power. The mansion, grand and imposing, had transformed into a pressure cooker. Each glance, word, and gesture carried significance, each interaction a battlefield. The Montclair's arrogance clashed with Amina's composed defiance, generating friction that could no longer be contained. In this environment, every action had ceased. The stage was set. The spark event had ignited change. Resistance had begun to crack the family's control, and now, rising tensions ensured that every day would be a contest of wit, will, and endurance. Amina's quiet courage was no longer just a personal act. It had become a force that threatened to expose the cracks in the Montclair's empire of superiority. That evening, after the last guests had departed and the mansion sank into its usual quiet, Amina found herself alone in the kitchen, cleaning and arranging dishes with meticulous care. Lydia, who had lingered to finish her own tasks, finally broke the silence. "Amina, you've always carried yourself differently, haven't you?" she asked softly, her eyes searching for a hint of the story behind Amina's calm strength. Amina paused, her hand hovering over a polished silver tray, and glanced at her friend. "It's not just about pride, Lydia," she said quietly. "It's about knowing who I am, even when no one else does." Her voice, calm yet steady, carried a weight born from years of hardship. She finally began to recount fragments of her past, memories carefully selected to explain the quiet resolve that had carried her through every insult, every humiliation. She spoke of a childhood spent in a small village, far from the opulence of the Montclairs. Her family had struggled, facing poverty, illness, and the relentless pressure of a society that often overlooked people like them. Her parents had instilled in her a sense of dignity and self-worth, teaching her that her value was never determined by others' opinions. But she also shared the loss that had shaped her, the sudden death of her younger brother, a tragedy that had left her carrying grief quietly while learning to navigate a world that demanded survival over sentiment. Lydia listened, moved, her own eyes reflecting tears she refused to let fall. "I never knew," she whispered, understanding for the first time the depth behind Amina's strength. Every carefully measured step, every moment of silent defiance, now made sense. Amina's calm in the face of the Montclair's cruelty was not arrogance or pride. It was the armor forged in pain, loss, and perseverance. The backstory deepened the audience's connection to Amina. Her defiance was not born from a desire to rebel for its own sake. It was rooted in a lifetime of endurance, in lessons learned from both joy and tragedy. Each insult from the Montclairs, every moment of humiliation, was a test she had faced before in smaller ways, and each had reinforced the quiet, unyielding strength she now carried through the halls of the mansion. Even Lydia, who had long feared the Montclair's wrath, felt a surge of admiration and hope. If Amina could endure such loss and still stand tall, then perhaps there was a path for her to confront this present challenge, not with anger, but with courage and precision. The kitchen, once just a place of labor, became a sanctuary of reflection and revelation. Amina's story, shared in whispers and shadows, echoed with resilience. The spark event, the humiliation, and the rising tension in the mansion were no longer isolated moments. They were part of a larger narrative, a struggle between oppression and dignity, arrogance and grace. The following morning, sunlight streamed softly through the Montclair mansion's windows, painting the marble floors with a warm glow. Amina moved with quiet purpose, her mind still carrying the weight of yesterday's revelations and the evening's shared memories with Lydia. Though her heart remained guarded, there was a flicker of relief in knowing she was not entirely alone. As she arranged fresh flowers in the grand foyer, Lydia sidled closer, lowering her voice. "I've been thinking, maybe there's a way to get through to them without losing ourselves," she said, a tentative smile crossing her face. The words, simple as they were, sparked a rare warmth in Amina's chest. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that connection could be a weapon as well as comfort. Amina nodded, offering a small, genuine smile. "Perhaps," she replied softly, "but it has to be subtle. They notice everything and underestimate nothing." There was a mutual understanding in their exchange, a fragile alliance forming not just from survival, but from shared recognition of one another's strength. Later, during breakfast, a quiet moment arose between Amina and one of the younger Montclair's siblings, Sophie, who often lingered at the edge of the dining room observing the staff. Sophie had witnessed the morning of the Spark event, and her curiosity was evident in the way she tilted her head, eyes tracking Amina's movements. Hesitant, Sophie finally asked, "Why don't you just get angry?" Her question was genuine, tinged with youthful innocence. Amina paused, setting down a tray of freshly baked pastries. "Anger doesn't always change things," she said gently. "Sometimes, calm and dignity speak louder than shouting ever could." Sophie studied her silently, absorbing the lesson, the subtle power in the way Amina carried herself. A small, unspoken bond began to form, bridging the invisible walls between staff and family, humility and curiosity. Even Lydia noticed the shift. The mansion, usually a place of rigid hierarchy, now carried tiny sparks of connection. Small gestures, a shared glance, a knowing smile, a whispered word of advice, reminded Amina that resilience did not mean isolation. These moments of fragile trust, carefully nurtured, laid the groundwork for future alliances and subtle influence within the household. By the end of the morning, the mansion felt slightly different. The tension between staff and family remained, but beneath it, quiet threads of understanding and connection had begun to weave a more intricate emotional web. The Spark event had ignited conflict. The resistance had hardened it. But now, through subtle bonding, Amina began to build the foundations of influence, patience, and the quiet strategy that would shape the coming days. The mansion, though grand and polished, began to feel constricting as new pressures arose. Word of the Spark event had quietly spread among the staff, whispers circulating through corridors and kitchens, carrying admiration for Amina's composure, but also warning of potential retaliation from the Montclairs. The household, already tense, now teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Ethan, determined to reassert dominance, began scrutinizing Amina more closely. Small tasks became tests, the precision of her dusting, the timing of her service, even the angle at which she held a tray. Each glance or gesture was loaded with expectation, and every interaction felt like a minefield. Yet Amina met each challenge with her calm, measured composure, refusing to let minor provocations shake her resolve. Vivian, sensing the fragility of their authority, escalated subtle punishments. She reassigned duties, demanded extra hours, and orchestrated minor humiliations designed to remind Amina and the staff of their place. But each act of control was met with quiet, deliberate professionalism from Amina, whose dignity only highlighted the cruelty of her oppressors. The complications extended beyond household dynamics. A high-profile investor, invited to the mansion after the gala, lingered on the staff's whispered stories of the Spark event. His casual questions and curious observations created an additional layer of pressure. Ethan, desperate to maintain his image, found himself flustered in front of outsiders, while Vivian's elegance wavered under the strain of scrutiny. Even the other staff felt the growing tension. They were caught between fear of retaliation and admiration for Amina's courage. Some began to question their own compliance, debating whether they would continue to endure humiliation or quietly follow Amina's example. This subtle unrest threatened the careful order of the mansion, and every passing day brought new challenges that compounded the original conflict. Meanwhile, Amina navigated these escalating complications with careful strategy. Each task, each interaction, became an opportunity to assert her presence without overtly confronting authority. Small victories, a perfectly timed service, a patient response to a sharp remark, built a pattern that both challenged and unsettled the Montclairs. The mansion, once a symbol of flawless control, now vibrated with tension, uncertainty, and the quiet power of resilience. The spark event had ignited resistance. Rising tensions had fueled it. And now complications threatened to pull every character into unforeseen confrontations. Amina's quiet strength remained the center of this storm, a force around which the household's fragile order would continue to fracture. Late one evening, the mansion was unusually quiet. Most of the staff had finished their duties, and the Montclairs had retreated to their private quarters. Amina lingered in the servants' quarters, tidying supplies, when Lydia approached with a hesitant expression. "There's something I haven't told you," she said softly, lowering her voice. "Something about Vivian, something that might explain why she's like this." Amina paused, curiosity and caution warring in her mind. "Go on," she urged, leaning slightly closer. Lydia took a deep breath. "Vivian, she wasn't always the cold, calculating woman we see today. Years ago, she faced a scandal that nearly ruined her family's reputation. A failed marriage, betrayal by a trusted friend, whispers in high society. She had to fight tooth and nail to reclaim her position. Since then, she's built walls around herself, controlling everything to ensure nothing like that ever happens again. That fear, that obsession with power, that's what drives her cruelty, her obsession with perfection, her constant scrutiny." Amina absorbed the revelation, a flicker of understanding softening her features. Vivian's arrogance and harshness were not born merely of privilege. They were shields forged in a life of betrayal, loss, and relentless pressure. Her coldness, though deeply oppressive, was rooted in fear and a need to protect herself and her family's image. This knowledge did not excuse Vivian's behavior, but it gave Amina perspective. The woman's actions, while cruel, were not entirely malicious. They were a product of pain and survival. It was a subtle reminder that every person carries invisible burdens, and that power can be a mask for vulnerability. Even Lydia, sharing this secret, seemed to feel lighter, as if the truth itself had created a shift in the household dynamic. Amina realized that understanding Vivian's past could be a key, not to submission, but to navigating the Montclair's world with strategy and insight. Knowledge became a weapon, a way to anticipate actions and respond with both dignity and precision. The mansion, steeped in opulence and tension, now held a new layer of complexity. The spark event, the rising tensions, and the recent complications were not merely external forces. They intersected with hidden histories, past wounds, and fragile psyches. As Amina prepared for the next day, she carried not just courage, but a deeper understanding of those who sought to control her, ready to use insight as carefully as her composure. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Montclair mansion, casting warm patterns across the polished floors. Amina moved gracefully through the corridors, her presence calm, yet unmistakable. The events of recent days, the spark event, the humiliation, the revelations, had begun to reshape not only her confidence but the atmosphere among those around her. Lydia stayed close, offering small gestures of support, a reassuring nod when a Montclair insult hung in the air, a whispered warning of a potential trap, and occasionally, a shared laugh over the absurdity of some of the family's petty rules. These moments, fleeting yet significant, allowed Amina to feel a sense of camaraderie and subtle solidarity within the staff. Even Sophie, the young Montclair sibling, found reasons to approach her quietly, curious about the woman who moved with such poise despite constant scrutiny. "How do you stay so calm?" Sophie asked one morning, her voice low and hesitant. Amina smiled softly. "Calm comes from knowing who you are and what you won't let others take from you," she replied. Sophie, absorbing the lesson, began to see that dignity and strength could exist even in worlds that demanded subservience. Small, shared gestures began to ripple through the mansion. Amina offered brief, courteous smiles to staff who were previously unnoticed. Lydia, encouraged by the subtle shift, engaged more openly with the younger servants, sharing stories and laughter. Even the Montclairs, though unaware, started to sense the change, Amina's composed defiance was no longer isolated, but quietly inspiring those around her. During breakfast, an awkward incident occurred. A spilled glass of juice threatened to provoke Vivian's anger, but before a sharp reprimand could fall, Amina moved quickly and skillfully to correct it, all while maintaining grace. The simple act diffused potential conflict, and Lydia whispered with admiration, "You've got them thinking twice now." Amina nodded silently, recognizing that her influence was growing not through confrontation alone, but through consistency, intelligence, and quiet presence. Through these small bonds, shared smiles, whispered words, and subtle acts of support, the mansion's rigid dynamics began to bend, if only slightly. Trust and understanding formed fragile bridges between staff and among those who had previously felt powerless. Humor, patience, and simple kindness became tools as potent as any argument, softening walls while building resilience. By the end of the morning, Amina felt the first real sense of connection beyond survival. The mansion, though still imposing and full of tension, had begun to respond to her presence in subtle ways. The spark event had ignited resistance, complications had tested it, and now, deepening bonds provided the foundation for strategy, solidarity, and quiet influence within a world that had tried to render her invisible. The mansion had never felt more suffocating. Amina moved quietly through the grand halls, her heart heavy despite the subtle victories she had achieved. The spark event, the mounting tensions, and the fragile bonds she had nurtured now seemed fragile against the looming storm. It arrived in the form of an unexpected dinner guest. Ethan's business rival, a man known for ruthless manipulation and keen insight into the weaknesses of the wealthy. He arrived under the pretense of a casual meeting, but his intent was clear: to exploit any cracks in the Montclair's household. From the moment he stepped into the dining room, the air thickened with unease. During dinner, the rival made a pointed comment about the staff, slyly highlighting Amina's presence and her unusual poise. "Such composure in a servant," he remarked with a thin smile. "It's almost unnerving, don't you think?" His words were subtle, but the implications were sharp. Ethan bristled, his pride wounded, and Vivian's composure wavered, her eyes darting toward Amina with a mixture of suspicion and irritation. Amina, caught in the scrutiny of the family and the rival, felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. The careful balance she had maintained was threatened, and for the first time in weeks, she questioned whether her dignity and strategy would withstand direct manipulation. The rival's insinuations sparked open tension. Ethan snapped at minor mistakes, his frustration magnified by embarrassment in front of the guest. Vivian's usual icy control faltered, and even Sophie, who had begun to admire Amina, watched in confusion and fear. The household, which had already been a battlefield of invisible forces, now teetered on the edge of open conflict. Amina's internal struggle intensified. She felt the sting of doubt, the fear that her quiet defiance might not be enough to withstand external pressure. The mansion, normally a place of strict hierarchy and predictable order, had become a crucible of emotion, anger, shame, fear, and frustration clashing in every room. Yet even at this lowest point, Amina's resolve did not break. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high. This was the shatter point, the moment when every strain, every insult, and every challenge converged. It was a test not just of her strength, but of the courage, patience, and wisdom she had cultivated. The mansion, once a fortress of power and control, now seemed fragile. The spark event, the mounting tensions, and the external threat had converged, shaking the foundations of the household. And in the center of it all stood Amina, poised and determined, knowing that how she responded in this moment would shape the course of the entire story. The morning after the shatter point, the mansion carried a heavy, uneasy silence. Staff moved carefully, avoiding the rooms where tension still lingered like a dense fog. Amina, mindful of every step and glance, prepared for another day where patience, strategy, and composure would be her only allies. Unexpectedly, help arrived in a form she had not anticipated. Mr. Daniels, the Montclair's longtime butler and a quiet observer of the household for decades, approached her in the pantry. His face, lined with age and experience, carried a subtle warmth and understanding that contrasted sharply with the family's harshness. "Amina," he said softly, "you've handled yourself with grace where most would falter. Let me share a few things that might help you navigate this house more safely." Amina's curiosity piqued. She listened intently as Mr. Daniels outlined subtle dynamics within the mansion, explaining hidden routines, the Montclair's temperaments, and small but critical patterns that could be leveraged. He shared tips for timing, approach, and communication. Ways to maintain dignity while minimizing unnecessary conflict. It was not about defiance, he explained, but about strategy, foresight, and patience. The gesture itself shifted the balance. For the first time, Amina realized she was not entirely alone. A silent ally existed within the mansion's walls, someone who understood the power dynamics, yet valued integrity. This subtle support bolstered her confidence, providing both reassurance and tactical insight. Even more, Mr. Daniels' intervention reminded Amina of a critical truth. Influence need not always be loud or confrontational. Quiet guidance, discreet alliances, and small gestures could shift the weight of control in ways the Montclairs would never see coming. She absorbed his advice carefully, knowing it would serve her in both immediate and long-term struggles. Meanwhile, Lydia observed the interaction with relief. The presence of an unexpected ally meant that Amina's path was no longer solely reliant on her own resilience. She now had guidance from someone with experience, someone who understood the mansion and its hidden rules. The mansion's oppressive energy, though still present, now felt slightly less absolute. By the end of the morning, Amina felt renewed focus. The spark event, rising tensions, complications, and the Shatterpoint had tested her strength. But with a helping hand from Mr. Daniels, she now had the insight and subtle support to begin shaping the next phase of her journey, moving from survival and resistance toward quiet empowerment, strategy, and eventual vindication. The evening settled over the Montclair mansion, painting the grand halls in muted gold and shadow. The chaos of the past weeks, the spark event, humiliation, rising tensions, and the Shatterpoint, had left marks on every resident, visible or unseen. Amina found a quiet corner in the servants' quarters, a small refuge where she could finally breathe and reflect on the whirlwind surrounding her. Her mind turned over the events, the humiliation she had endured, and the quiet victories she had achieved. The realization dawned that dignity was not merely surviving insults. It was measured by composure, patience, and strategic action. She considered her interactions with Lydia, Sophie, and now Mr. Daniels, recognizing the fragile bonds that could be strengthened into support. Reflection illuminated patterns she could leverage, subtle insights into the Montclair's behavior that would help her navigate the house more safely and with greater influence. Across the mansion, Ethan paced in his study, alone with his thoughts. Pride and embarrassment clashed violently in his mind. He questioned his authority, wondering how a single incident, a maid's defiance, had shaken him so profoundly. Reflection forced him to confront flaws long ignored: arrogance, underestimation of others, and the fragility of control built solely on fear. For the first time, he sensed that power without respect was hollow. Vivian, too, sat in her private chamber, a mirror of her usual self-reflection turned inward. The revelation of her past, the subtle shifts in staff loyalty, and Amina's calm defiance forced her to question long-held assumptions. Was her relentless pursuit of perfection worth the emotional isolation it caused? Could control coexist with humanity? These thoughts gnawed at her, revealing the cracks beneath the ice of her exterior. Even Sophie lingered near the edges of reflection, wondering if courage could truly come in quiet forms. She had observed Amina and Lydia navigating the household with intelligence, patience, and subtle influence. These examples challenged Sophie's assumptions about strength, obedience, and the hierarchy she had taken for granted. By nightfall, the mansion was silent, yet heavy with the weight of introspection. Each character, Montclair and servant alike, grappled with their choices, flaws, and the consequences of the past days. Reflection illuminated possibilities, paths of change, the potential for reconciliation, and the power of dignity tempered with strategy. Amina, sitting alone with her thoughts, felt a calm resolve settling over her. The past had been harsh, but reflection had offered clarity. Every insult, every trial, and every act of courage had shaped her understanding of herself and the household. She knew that the next steps would require wisdom, patience, and courage, but she also recognized that she was no longer merely surviving. She was preparing to transform her position, subtly and powerfully, within the mansion she now quietly commanded with grace. The mansion awoke to another day of restrained tension, but beneath the surface, the energy had shifted. Amina moved with quiet confidence, aware of the bonds she had deepened and the subtle insights gained from Mr. Daniels and Lydia. Today, however, the choice that would alter the trajectory of events lay not with her alone, but with Ethan. In the library, Ethan sat with a rare moment of stillness, staring at a stack of financial reports and invitations for social events. His mind, however, was consumed not by numbers, but by Amina's quiet defiance. Her composure, dignity, and unwavering presence had unsettled him in ways he could not ignore. For the first time, he faced a choice: continue asserting dominance through fear and arrogance, or extend a hand of understanding, acknowledgement, and respect. Vivian, observing from the drawing room, noted his hesitation. Though she remained cautious, she sensed that a decision in favor of reconciliation or respect could reshape the household entirely. Her own past, her need for control, and the cracks in her ice-cold composure made her silently question whether collaboration, rather than punishment, might yield greater stability. Meanwhile, Amina completed her morning rounds, aware that her own choices would influence the outcome. She could respond defensively, escalate confrontation, or maintain her calm and extend subtle gestures that encouraged a positive shift. Her patience, cultivated through hardship, guided her toward strategy over impulsive action. The pivotal moment arrived when Ethan, hesitating near the grand staircase, called her gently. "Amina, could we speak?" His voice carried an unusual blend of curiosity, hesitation, and acknowledgement. The choice he had made, reaching out instead of lashing out, signaled the first crack in his rigid pride. Amina approached, her posture composed, her eyes steady. "Yes, sir," she replied, careful to maintain dignity without condescension. The conversation that followed was quiet, deliberate, and careful, with Ethan admitting some awareness of his faults and Amina responding with insight tempered by patience. Small acknowledgments, subtle agreements, and cautious understanding formed a fragile bridge between authority and respect. This moment of choice shifted the mansion's dynamics. Power no longer relied solely on fear or status. It now depended on mutual recognition and cautious cooperation. Amina's grace, patience, and intelligence had not only preserved her dignity, but opened the door to influence and subtle change. By the end of the morning, the mansion felt slightly different. The spark event, rising tensions, complications, and the shatter point had tested every character. But this choice, a conscious decision to reach across the divide, offered hope, signaling that change, however gradual, was possible. The household's future would be shaped not by domination alone, but by respect, strategy, and courage, quietly orchestrated by those willing to make the right choice. The morning light filtered gently through the Montclair mansion, casting soft warmth over the polished floors and ornate furniture. A subtle shift lingered in the air, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The choice Ethan had made, reaching out to Amina with respect and cautious acknowledgement, had begun to ripple through the household. Amina moved with her usual poise, but now there was a new layer of confidence. The subtle acknowledgement from Ethan, coupled with her growing bonds with Lydia, Sophie, and Mr. Daniels, made her feel less isolated and more empowered. Small smiles exchanged in the halls, quiet nods of understanding from staff, and minor gestures of appreciation began to soften the mansion's tense atmosphere. Vivian, observing from her drawing room, noted the shift with measured surprise. Her sharp control and icy demeanor had softened slightly, though cautiously. The cracks in her armor allowed for subtle warmth. A brief smile at a well-timed action, a nod toward Amina's careful management of household chaos. Slowly, the impossible rigidity of the Montclair household began to bend, ever so slightly, toward cooperation. Even the younger Montclair siblings sensed change. Sophie lingered near Amina during breakfast, shyly offering assistance with tasks or pausing to ask questions. These small interactions, once unthinkable, now signaled curiosity, admiration, and tentative trust. Amina recognized these gestures as early signs of influence, not through confrontation, but through patience, integrity, and quiet strategy. Throughout the day, moments of reconciliation emerged. Ethan allowed Amina's suggestions on household arrangements. Vivian acknowledged minor efficiencies she would have previously ignored, and Mr. Daniels quietly facilitated communication that prevented further tension. Each small act reinforced hope, proving that patience and dignity could gradually transform even the most rigid power structures. The mansion, previously a place of suffocating control and tension, now vibrated with cautious optimism. Laughter returned in subtle ways. Soft jokes shared by Lydia and other staff, playful gestures from Sophie, and even Ethan's restrained humor in moments of lightness. The spark event, rising tensions, complications, and the shatter point had all tested the household, but now hope flickered like a candle flame, fragile yet persistent. Amina, standing at the edge of the grand foyer and observing the gentle shifts, allowed herself a quiet smile. Progress was slow, and challenges remained, but the mansion's energy had begun to change. Through courage, patience, and strategic grace, the impossible was becoming possible. Small victories, subtle reconciliations, and shared understanding were rekindling hope within every corner of the household. The Montclair mansion had begun to breathe differently. The previous days of tension, humiliation, and quiet victories had created fragile harmony, yet beneath the surface, the storm was far from over. Just as hope seemed to settle, an unexpected challenge emerged, one that threatened to undo every small gain. A prominent social reporter, known for exposing the scandals of the elite, arrived at the mansion under the guise of covering a charitable event. Rumors of the Spark event and Amina's defiance had reached him, and he had come hungry for a story that would captivate the public. His presence immediately rattled the household. Whispers filled the halls, servants tensed, and the Montclair's polished composure wavered under the scrutiny of potential exposure. Ethan's confidence faltered. He had been slowly accepting Amina's influence and guidance, but now the threat of public humiliation and reputation damage loomed large. Vivian's icy demeanor tightened. Years of carefully curated appearances could crumble with a single misstep. Even Sophie looked on in silent fear, unsure of how the household would react. Amina, however, remained poised. She recognized the reporter's intent, yet she also understood the opportunity this presented. This final obstacle was not only a test of her patience and strategy, but also a chance to solidify the respect and subtle authority she had been cultivating. With calm precision, she coordinated with Lydia and Mr. Daniels, ensuring every interaction, every detail, and every arrangement projected dignity and professionalism. During the event, Amina's composed presence became the anchor. She guided guests subtly, defused awkward situations before they escalated, and maintained the mansion's elegance under pressure. The Montclairs, initially rigid with fear and pride, began to follow her lead, trusting the quiet wisdom she projected. Each small action deflected potential scandal while reinforcing order and respect. The reporter, observing the seamless handling of the event, found no sensational story to exploit. Instead, he recorded a portrait of composure, unity, and subtle power, one that contrasted sharply with the chaos he had expected. Amina's quiet courage, patience, and strategic grace had transformed what could have been a disaster into a display of competence and dignity. By the evening's end, the mansion's fragile harmony was tested but intact. The final obstacle had arrived with the potential to unravel everything. Yet Amina's presence, combined with the cautious cooperation of Ethan, Vivian, and the household staff, ensured that the family's reputation and her own dignity remained unscathed. The Spark event, resistance, complications, Shatterpoint, and all preceding acts had built toward this moment, where courage and patience triumphed over fear and chaos. The mansion had never felt so charged with anticipation. After days of tension, humiliation, subtle victories, and near disasters, the time for revelation had finally arrived. The Spark event and every act since had built toward a single turning point, where truth, courage, and dignity would break through the layers of pride and fear. It began during a quiet evening in the drawing room. Amina, moving with her usual grace, noticed Ethan and Vivian sitting in uncharacteristic silence, their expressions unreadable. The recent challenges, the spark event, the reporter's visit, and the subtle shifts in the household had forced them to confront truths they had long avoided. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Amina, we've underestimated you. Your strength, your composure, your dignity. It's not just admirable, it's changed how we see ourselves and this household." Vivian, after a moment of hesitation, added softly, "And perhaps we've let fear and pride dictate too much of our lives. Seeing how you handled everything has shown me a different way, a way to command respect without crushing it." Her eyes, usually guarded and icy, held a hint of humility. The breakthrough was clear. Acknowledgement and truth were finally emerging from the shadows of control and fear. Amina's heart, though cautious, allowed herself a subtle smile. The breakthrough was not just their recognition. It was the validation of the patience, courage, and integrity she had maintained through every humiliation and challenge. Her quiet defiance had shifted the power dynamics, revealing that dignity and strategic grace could outlast arrogance and oppression. Even Sophie, who had observed quietly from the edges of the room, stepped closer. "I want to learn from you," she whispered, her youthful curiosity now mingled with respect. Amina nodded, understanding that influence could take many forms, and that nurturing potential in others was a quiet victory in itself. The mansion seemed to breathe differently that night. The tension that had once been suffocating now felt lighter, replaced by the possibility of understanding, cooperation, and subtle reconciliation. The spark event, resistance, complications, and every trial had led to this moment, a breakthrough where truth, dignity, and courage reshaped relationships and revealed new paths forward. Amina, standing quietly in the center of the room, recognized the power of what had been achieved. The Montclairs had begun to see the strength not only in her, but in themselves, as they learned that respect and humility could coexist with authority and control. The breakthrough was complete, a quiet victory for patience, courage, and integrity. Sunlight poured through the grand windows of the Montclair mansion, illuminating spaces that had long felt cold and oppressive. The mansion, once a stage for humiliation, tension, and rigid control, now thrummed with a quiet harmony, a delicate balance born from courage, patience, and integrity. Amina moved gracefully through the halls, no longer merely surviving, but quietly commanding respect. The spark event, the rising tensions, the complications, the shatter point, and every challenge had led to this moment. She had turned humiliation into strength, defiance into influence, and quiet dignity into undeniable power. Her presence was no longer just tolerated, it was acknowledged, respected, and even admired. Ethan, once consumed by pride and arrogance, had begun to shift. He offered genuine collaboration and cautious respect, learning that leadership could coexist with humility. Vivian, softened by understanding and reflection, embraced subtle compassion alongside her authority. The Montclair household, transformed, now functioned not through fear, but through mutual recognition of strengths and limitations. Sophie, inspired by Amina's journey, had begun learning lessons in courage and integrity. Lydia and Mr. Daniels, who had quietly supported her, smiled with satisfaction, knowing that the household's dynamics had been reshaped without overt confrontation or cruelty. Even the other staff, once nervous and wary, moved with renewed confidence, sensing that their dignity was no longer secondary to the whims of arrogance. Amina paused in the grand foyer, looking around at the transformed mansion. Every challenge had tested her patience, courage, and intelligence, but she had prevailed. She had not merely survived. She had elevated herself and influenced those around her through strength, grace, and unwavering dignity. The Montclairs, humbled and awakened, recognized the truth that respect and compassion were more powerful than intimidation and control. The mansion, once a symbol of rigid hierarchy and fear, had become a place of quiet resilience, understanding, and subtle unity. In that moment, the story found its resolution. Humiliation had been transformed into empowerment. Conflict had been met with strategy and patience, and courage had triumphed over oppression. Amina's 5 words, the ones that had frozen the Montclairs at the Spark event, echoed not just in memory, but in the foundation of a household forever changed. Dignity, courage, patience, and quiet strength could never be broken. The mansion, and everyone within it, would carry the lessons of this transformation forward. Proof that even in the face of arrogance, cruelty, and doubt, integrity and resilience always prevail. My beautiful family, this story reminds us that true strength isn't about power, wealth, or the ability to humiliate others. It's about courage, patience, dignity, and resilience, even in the face of cruelty. Sometimes, the quietest voice carries the loudest impact. If you were in Amina's shoes, how would you have responded to the Montclair's humiliation? Would you fight back with words, patience, or strategy? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this one, then you'll absolutely love the next. It's even crazier and more captivating than you can imagine. So go ahead and click the video showing right here on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.